There's a version of this war that Moscow does not want its own citizens to see, and that version is now arriving anyway, delivered not by television but by empty pumps, dark windows, and long lines of cars outside gas stations from Kaliningrad to Kamchatka. Military analysts speaking to The Sun describe a campaign that has quietly reshaped the balance of this conflict, a systematic effort by Ukraine's armed forces to strike at the oil and gas infrastructure that keeps the Russian war machine moving, and by extension, keeps the Russian state functioning at all. The claim these analysts are making is not a modest one. They argue that if this campaign continues at its current pace, it is capable of paralyzing the Kremlin's military machine from the inside, not through a dramatic battlefield collapse, but through the slow, grinding suffocation of the logistics that every modern army depends on. Fuel does not just move tanks. It moves trucks carrying artillery shells. It powers the generators that keep field hospitals running. It fuels the aircraft that fly sorties, and it heats the buildings where soldiers are trained before they are sent to the front. Take fuel away, or even make it scarce and unpredictable, and everything downstream of it begins to falter. That is the theory, and increasingly, it is being backed up by what is visible on the ground inside Russia itself. The regime has already faced widespread fuel shortages that are no longer confined to the occupied territories or border regions, but have spread into the Russian heartland. There have been widespread power outages, the kind that used to be treated as isolated technical failures, but are now happening with a frequency that is difficult to explain away. And there have been what independent trackers and Ukrainian officials describe as record losses of manpower, numbers so large that even Putin himself has been forced into rare public acknowledgments that something is wrong. For a leader whose entire domestic narrative has depended on presenting the war as a controlled, manageable, even routine military operation, any admission of strain is notable. When the man at the top of a tightly controlled information system starts using words that hint at difficulty, it usually means the difficulty has become too large to hide. Among the voices weighing in on what this all means is Ben Hodges, the former commanding general of United States Army Europe, a man who has spent decades thinking about exactly this kind of warfare and exactly this kind of adversary. Hodges is convinced that the strategic initiative, the ability to dictate the tempo and shape of the war, has now completely passed into Ukraine's hands. That is a striking statement for anyone who remembers the early narratives of this war, when Russian ground forces appeared to have overwhelming advantages in manpower, armor, and artillery. Hodges points to a set of concrete indicators to support his view. Russian ground defensive operations, he argues, have effectively ground to a halt across most of the front. The kind of large-scale, multi-axis advances that characterize the opening phases of the invasion are simply not happening anymore. What remains are smaller, grinding, costly pushes that gain meters rather than kilometers, at a human cost that is difficult to sustain indefinitely. Just as significant, in Hodges' assessment, is what has happened to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which he says has ceased to be a significant factor of influence in this war. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the Black Sea Fleet was once considered one of the crown jewels of Russian military power in the region, a force that was supposed to dominate the maritime space, blockade Ukrainian ports, and project power along the entire southern coastline. Instead, through a combination of missile strikes, naval drone attacks, and relentless pressure from a country that, at the start of the war, had no meaningful navy of its own, that fleet has been pushed back, picked apart, and largely neutralized as a strategic threat. Ships that once patrolled with impunity now shelter far from the coastline, and even then, they are not entirely safe. It is one of the more remarkable reversals of the entire conflict, a reminder that modern warfare does not always reward the side with the largest, most traditionally impressive military assets. The catalyst for this broader shift, according to the analysts cited, was a sustained, roughly 40-day blitzkrieg using hundreds of attack drones and long-range missiles, a campaign aimed with precision at the arteries of Russian oil and gas infrastructure. This was not a scattershot approach. It targeted refineries, storage depots, pumping stations, and the logistics nodes that connect Russia's vast oil fields to the pipelines, railways, and ports that move that fuel to where it is needed, whether that is a domestic gas station or a military supply depot near the front. The scale and persistence of the campaign is what analysts believe made the difference. A single strike on a refinery might be repaired within weeks. Dozens of coordinated strikes across many facilities, sustained over more than a month, create a cumulative effect that outpaces Russia's ability to repair, rebuild, and reroute. It becomes less like a single wound and more like a slow bleed from many places at once, one that the body cannot fully staunch before the next cut appears. There's a particular kind of psychological argument embedded in all of this too, one that surfaces in commentary about who actually bears the cost of this war inside Russian society. The observation is a blunt one. If all the privileged young people suddenly had to put on these green Russian army uniforms, then the enthusiasm for supporting this war would really diminish. It is a point that has been made in various forms throughout the conflict, but it carries particular weight now, as the economic and infrastructural strain of the war becomes harder to hide from the urban middle and upper classes in Moscow and St. Petersburg. For much of the war, the human cost has fallen disproportionately on poorer regions, on ethnic minorities, on rural areas far from the capital, places where recruitment drives and financial incentives for enlistment have found their most receptive audiences. That has allowed a kind of social bargain to persist in Russia's major cities, an unspoken arrangement in which life continues largely as normal for those with money, connections, and urban privilege, while the war happens somewhere else, to someone else. The moment that bargain breaks down, the moment the war starts showing up in the driveways and dinner tables of Moscow's elite, the political calculus changes. That is precisely why the question of expanded mobilization touching the privileged classes is treated as such a serious risk factor for the Kremlin. It is not just about finding more soldiers. It is about what happens to public sentiment when the war can no longer be kept at arm's length from the people who have historically been shielded from it. The fuel crisis itself is described in stark terms. God, referenced here as an analyst offering commentary on the situation, has noted that ongoing attacks on oil depots and refineries have triggered a serious crisis, one that now extends across more than 50 regions of Russia currently experiencing acute fuel shortages. Strict limits have reportedly been imposed at gas stations in many of these areas, a detail that carries enormous symbolic weight in a country that is, on paper, one of the largest oil and gas producers on the planet. There is a particular irony that is hard to overstate here. Russia's economy, its state budget, its geopolitical leverage in Europe and beyond, has for decades been built substantially on its identity as an energy superpower. To see that same country now rationing fuel at the pump in dozens of its own regions is a symbol that is difficult for state media to spin away entirely, no matter how tightly controlled the domestic narrative remains. It speaks to a fundamental mismatch between extraction capacity and distribution capacity, a mismatch that becomes catastrophic when the distribution infrastructure itself is being systematically targeted. Layered on top of the fuel crisis is what analysts describe as a parallel and equally deliberate campaign, Ukraine's effort to isolate occupied Crimea from the broader Russian energy and logistics network. Crimea has always occupied a unique place in this conflict, both practically and symbolically. Practically, it serves as a critical logistics hub, a staging ground for operations in southern Ukraine, and a base for what remains of Russian naval power in the region. Symbolically, it was the first piece of Ukrainian territory Russia seized back in 2014, and its continued occupation has long been treated by the Kremlin as a kind of proof of concept, evidence that territorial conquest through force could be made to stick. Undermining Russia's grip on Crimea, therefore, carries weight far beyond its immediate military value. The destruction of key infrastructure, including the Henichesk Bridge and other logistics arteries connecting the peninsula to the Russian-controlled mainland, has reportedly led to power outages across Crimea and forced the occupying authorities to declare a state of emergency. These are not abstract inconveniences. A peninsula that depends heavily on external supply lines for electricity, water, and fuel becomes acutely vulnerable when those supply lines are cut or degraded. Residents face blackouts, fuel shortages of their own, and a growing sense that the territory they live in has become a liability rather than an asset for the power that claims to control it. For the Russian military specifically, a Crimea that cannot reliably receive fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements is a Crimea that cannot function as the springboard for operations it was designed to be. Keir Giles, a widely respected expert on Russian military and political affairs, offers a particularly sharp assessment of what this all adds up to. In his view, holding Crimea is becoming increasingly impossible for Moscow, not necessarily because of an imminent ground assault, but because the logistics and infrastructure that make occupation sustainable are being systematically dismantled from a distance. Giles also makes a broader observation about how the war is being communicated, or rather miscommunicated, within Russian society. He notes that Putin is gradually being forced to publicly acknowledge more and more of the realities of the war, a shift that matters enormously in a system built on carefully managed information. Every acknowledgement, however small or carefully worded, represents a crack in a narrative architecture that was designed to be seamless. According to Giles, Ukraine's long-term goal of conveying this reality to Russians across the country is beginning to succeed. This is a strategic objective that is easy to overlook amid discussion of missile ranges and refinery damage, but it may ultimately be one of the more consequential dimensions of this campaign. Wars are not only won or lost on battlefields, they are also won or lost in the minds of the populations that are asked to sustain them, whether through taxation, conscription, rationing, or simply the day-to-day tolerance of disruption to ordinary life. If the Russian public begins to experience the war not as a distant, televised abstraction, but as a lived daily reality of fuel lines, blackouts, and empty shelves, the political space in which the Kremlin operates narrows considerably. Giles extends this line of thinking to its logical conclusion, suggesting that Putin may ultimately be forced to accept something that has arguably been clear for some time, that Russia has more to gain from freezing the conflict than from continuing the fighting if current trends continue. This is a notably cautious formulation, and it is worth treating it as such. It is not a prediction of imminent collapse or surrender. It is an argument about incentive structures, about the point at which the costs of continuing a war begin to outweigh whatever benefits continuing it might still theoretically offer. Freezing a conflict is very different from losing one, and very different from making the kind of concessions that would satisfy Ukrainian or Western demands for a genuine resolution. But even the suggestion that a frozen conflict might become the least bad option from Moscow's own perspective represents a meaningful shift in how seriously informed observers are treating Ukraine's strategic position. Ben Hodges returns to this theme with a particular emphasis that is worth dwelling on. The war, he says, has finally returned home to the Russians, and the situation for the Kremlin will only worsen this summer. For most of the conflict's duration, one of the more remarkable features of Russian society has been the degree to which ordinary daily life in the major cities has continued largely undisturbed. Restaurants stayed open, shopping centers stayed busy, and for a great many Russians who were not directly connected to soldiers at the front, the war remained something that happened elsewhere, filtered through state television in ways that made it feel manageable and distant. The kind of sustained infrastructure campaign described here threatens to erode that separation. Fuel shortages do not respect the line between combatant and civilian. Power outages do not check a resident's political views before cutting the electricity. When the war starts manifesting as inconvenience and hardship in everyday Russian life, the psychological distance that has protected the regime's domestic support begins to collapse. But Hodges is careful, and any serious analysis should be equally careful not to overstate the case into a prediction of certain and total collapse. He identifies 3 key conditions that would need to be met for the Russian military machine to fully collapse by the end of the year, and it is worth walking through each of these conditions individually, because they represent genuine points of uncertainty rather than settled outcomes. The first condition is Ukraine's ability to sustain and increase the current pace of long-range strikes. A 40-day blitzkrieg is, by definition, a finite and intense burst of activity. Sustaining that tempo, or even accelerating it, over months rather than weeks, requires an enormous and continuous supply of drones, missiles, trained crews, intelligence support, and logistical coordination. It is one thing to mount a dramatic, concentrated campaign. It is another thing entirely to keep that campaign running indefinitely without exhausting stockpiles, without suffering unacceptable losses of the platforms, carrying out these strikes, and without giving the adversary time to adapt. Ukraine's domestic drone industry has expanded dramatically over the course of this war, developing increasingly sophisticated long-range strike capabilities, but industrial capacity, no matter how impressive, has limits, and those limits will be tested severely if this pace is to be maintained through the rest of the year. The second condition is uninterrupted and large-scale technological support for this process from Western partners. This is, in some ways, the condition most outside of Ukraine's direct control. Long-range strike campaigns of this nature depend not only on domestically produced systems, but often on components, targeting intelligence, satellite imagery, and other forms of support that come from partner nations. Political shifts within any of the countries providing this support, changes in government, changes in public opinion, competing demands on defense budgets and industrial capacity could all affect the reliability and scale of that support. A campaign that depends on a steady external supply chain is only as sustainable as that supply chain's least reliable link. And predicting the political stability of multiple partner nations over a period of many months carries obvious uncertainty. The third condition is Russia's inability to find an effective countermeasure and protect its rear facilities from Ukrainian drones. This condition deserves particular attention because it represents the most direct form of adaptation an adversary can pursue. No military technology retains its advantage indefinitely without the other side attempting to respond. Russia has already begun investing heavily in air defense systems, specifically oriented toward protecting rear area infrastructure, in electronic warfare systems designed to jam or spoof drone guidance systems, and in hardened storage and dispersal strategies meant to reduce the vulnerability of critical facilities to concentrated strikes. Whether these countermeasures can keep pace with the evolving sophistication of Ukrainian long-range strike capability is genuinely uncertain, and it represents perhaps the single largest variable in determining whether the current trajectory continues, stalls, or reverses. Taken together, these 3 conditions illustrate an important point that responsible analysis should not obscure. The trajectory described by analysts like Hodges and Giles is a trend, not a certainty. Trends can continue, they can plateau, and they can reverse, particularly when the adversary being described is a large, resource-rich state with a demonstrated willingness to absorb enormous costs in pursuit of its objectives. The Russian state has, at multiple points throughout this war, shown a capacity to adapt to setbacks that many observers did not initially expect. That history counsels a degree of humility in projecting current trends forward with too much confidence. Still, the additional risk factor identified by these analysts, the possible forced mobilization of young people from Moscow and St. Petersburg, deserves serious consideration on its own terms, because it connects the infrastructure story back to the deeper political vulnerability underlying the entire Russian war effort. If the war affects the privileged classes directly, in a way that cannot be avoided through connections, payments, or simply staying in the right social circles, public support for the dictator within the country will instantly collapse, according to this line of analysis. That word instantly is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it reflects a broader theory about authoritarian systems that has some historical grounding. Authoritarian regimes often maintain stability not through genuine popular enthusiasm, but through a combination of coercion, propaganda, and the careful management of which segments of the population bear the direct costs of state policy. When those costs can no longer be contained to politically expendable groups, the regime's stability becomes far more fragile, far more quickly, than outside observers might expect based on years of apparent calm. While the Russian rear grapples with fuel chaos and the political risks associated with expanding mobilization, the situation on the front lines themselves continues to generate its own grim statistics, ones that speak to the human cost of the war in stark terms. Analysts and Ukrainian officials estimate that since 2022, the number of Russian personnel killed and wounded has exceeded 1 million, a figure that, if accurate, would represent one of the most catastrophic casualty tolls suffered by any military in a single conflict in the modern era. It is important to be clear about the nature of this figure. It comes primarily from Ukrainian and Western assessments, and Russian officials have consistently disputed casualty figures of this scale, offering their own dramatically lower estimates, as governments on all sides of virtually every war have historically done. Independent verification of exact casualty numbers in an active conflict is extraordinarily difficult, and any figure in the hundreds of thousands or millions should be understood as an estimate produced by parties with their own interests in how the war is perceived, rather than as a definitively confirmed fact. That said, even accounting for the inherent uncertainty in wartime casualty accounting, the scale of losses being described by multiple independent Western and Ukrainian sources points toward a conflict of extraordinary and sustained lethality, one that has ground on for years without the kind of decisive breakthrough that might justify such losses in purely military terms. Statistics drawn from line of battle clashes, according to these sources, reveal a staggering proportional imbalance, with claims that for every 8 Russian personnel killed, only 1 Ukrainian defender is lost. Again, this ratio should be treated as a claimed estimate rather than a verified fact, produced primarily by Ukrainian military sources, with an obvious interest in demonstrating operational effectiveness to domestic and international audiences alike. But even skeptical outside analysts have generally agreed that Ukrainian forces have, in many phases of this war, inflicted disproportionate casualties relative to their own losses, a pattern attributed to a combination of defensive positioning, superior drone reconnaissance and strike integration, and the poor quality of preparation among many Russian units thrown into offensive operations. Philip Ingram, a former British military intelligence officer, whose analysis has been widely cited throughout this conflict, offers a particular explanation for this imbalance that goes beyond simple numbers. He points to the technological evolution of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, arguing that Ukraine's rapid development and deployment of drone technology, precision targeting systems, and an increasingly sophisticated network connecting battlefield reconnaissance to strike capability has made it possible to offset the enemy's numerical superiority. This is, in some ways, the central technological story of this entire war. Russia entered the conflict with dramatically larger stockpiles of traditional military equipment, artillery pieces, armored vehicles, and personnel reserves than Ukraine could match through conventional means. What has changed the equation, according to Ingram and many other analysts, is Ukraine's ability to substitute mass with precision, using comparatively inexpensive drone systems to identify, track, and destroy targets that would once have required far more expensive and scarce conventional weapon systems to address. Ingram also points to a specific and troubling explanation for why Russian casualties have remained so high, even as the front lines have largely stabilized: the poor quality of training given to new recruits, many of whom are reportedly thrown into the trenches after just a few days of preparation. This detail matters enormously for understanding the human dimension of what is happening. A soldier who has received only a handful of days of training before being sent into combat lacks the basic situational awareness, tactical instincts, and survival skills that even a modestly trained soldier would possess. Under these conditions, according to the analysis being described, the average lifespan of a Russian soldier on the battlefield currently ranges from as little as 20 minutes during assault operations to, at best, a few weeks of overall survival in frontline positions. These figures, like the broader casualty estimates, should be understood as claims drawn from Ukrainian and Western military analysis rather than independently verified statistics. But they are consistent with a broader pattern that has been documented repeatedly throughout this war, a Russian approach to offensive operations that has often prioritized speed of mobilization over quality of preparation, sending large numbers of poorly trained personnel into heavily defended positions in a manner that produces enormous losses for often minimal territorial gain. It is worth stepping back at this point to consider what all of these threads, the fuel crisis, the isolation of Crimea, the neutralization of the Black Sea Fleet, the halted ground offensives, and the staggering casualty figures, actually add up to when considered together. The picture painted by these analysts is one of a war that has fundamentally changed shape. In its opening phase, this was a conflict defined by large armored formations, contested territory measured in tens of kilometers per week, and a Russian military that many expected to overwhelm its smaller neighbor within days. What has emerged instead, according to this analysis, is a war of attrition and infrastructure, one being fought as much through drone strikes on refineries hundreds of kilometers from the front as through direct clashes between infantry and armor. This is a different kind of war than the one many expected in February of 2022, and it demands a different kind of analysis to understand where it might be heading. There is also a broader lesson embedded in this story about the changing character of modern warfare more generally, one that extends well beyond this specific conflict. The traditional metrics of military power, the number of tanks, the size of standing armies, the tonnage of a navy, are proving to be less predictive of battlefield outcomes than they once were. A country with a fraction of its adversaries' traditional military resources has, according to this body of analysis, managed to neutralize a major naval fleet, systematically degrade a strategic energy sector, and stall ground offensives from a far larger opponent, primarily through the innovative and relentless application of relatively low-cost drone and missile technology. Whether or not every specific figure in this narrative holds up to full scrutiny, and some clearly deserve to be treated with appropriate skepticism, given their origin and wartime sources with obvious interests in shaping perception, the broader trend they describe, a war increasingly decided by infrastructure resilience, technological adaptation, and the sustainability of domestic political support, reflects something real about how conflicts between technologically sophisticated adversaries are likely to be fought in the years ahead. None of this, it should be said clearly, points toward an inevitable or imminent end to the war. Regimes under severe strain do not always collapse in the way that outside analysts predict, and the Russian state has substantial reserves, both economic and coercive, that it can continue to draw upon even under significant pressure. Sanctions have squeezed but not broken the Russian economy over several years now. The security apparatus that maintains domestic order remains, by most accounts, firmly under state control. And the three conditions Hodges outlines as necessary for full collapse by year's end, sustained and expanding Ukrainian strike capacity, uninterrupted Western technological support, and continued Russian failure to develop effective countermeasures, are each independently uncertain, and their simultaneous fulfillment is far from guaranteed. What can be said with somewhat greater confidence is that the character of this war has shifted in ways that were not widely anticipated even a year or two ago, and that the pressure being applied to Russian energy infrastructure, logistics networks, and manpower reserves represents a genuinely significant strategic development, regardless of exactly how the more dramatic casualty and battlefield statistics ultimately hold up under closer scrutiny. The fuel lines, forming in dozens of Russian regions, are real and documented. The infrastructure damage in Crimea is visible and verifiable through satellite imagery and independent reporting. The reduced operational tempo of the Black Sea Fleet has been observed and reported by multiple independent naval analysts, not solely by parties with an interest in the outcome. These are the load-bearing facts beneath the broader narrative, and they are substantial enough on their own to justify the attention this campaign has received from serious military analysts. Whether this pressure ultimately produces the kind of full collapse that some of the more optimistic assessments describe, or whether it instead produces a grinding, prolonged stalemate in which both sides absorb enormous costs without a clear resolution, or whether Russia manages to adapt and stabilize its rear area defenses in time to blunt the campaign's long-term effects, remains genuinely uncertain. An honest analysis has to sit with that uncertainty rather than resolve it prematurely in either direction. What is clear is that the war has entered a phase in which the outcome will be determined as much in refineries, power stations, and supply depots as it will be in trenches and fortified positions. And that the coming months, as the summer heat compounds existing fuel and infrastructure pressures, are likely to test the resilience of the Russian state's domestic arrangements in ways that will be difficult for even the most controlled information environment to fully obscure from its own population. It is also worth considering the economics underlying this campaign, because the numbers involved tell their own story about why this approach has proven so difficult for Russia to counter. A long-range attack drone, even a relatively sophisticated one, typically costs a fraction of what a single air defense missile costs to intercept it, and a fraction of what the refinery or storage facility it targets is worth to rebuild. This asymmetry in cost is not a minor technical detail. It is arguably the central strategic insight that has allowed a country with a dramatically smaller defense budget than its adversary to impose costs that are wildly disproportionate to its own expenditure. Every successful strike on a refinery forces a choice on Russian planners: divert scarce air defense assets to protect economic infrastructure deep in the rear, thinning out coverage elsewhere, or accept the ongoing damage and absorb the economic and political cost. Neither option is comfortable, and the fact that this dilemma repeats itself dozens of times across dozens of facilities is precisely what analysts mean when they describe the campaign as having a cumulative, compounding effect, rather than a series of isolated incidents. There is a further dimension to this story that deserves attention, which is the effect on Russia's ability to project and sustain military power beyond its own borders, not just within the war in Ukraine itself. A state whose domestic refining and distribution capacity is under sustained strain has less flexibility to support allied or client military operations elsewhere, less capacity to build the kind of strategic fuel reserves that would allow it to weather a longer, more attritional conflict, and less room to maneuver diplomatically when energy exports have historically been one of its primary sources of leverage over trading partners, particularly in Europe and parts of Asia. A Russia that is rationing fuel domestically is, almost by definition, a Russia with less capacity to use energy as a tool of geopolitical influence abroad, and that has knock-on effects for how the war is perceived not just inside Russia, but by the international partners, adversaries, and neutral observers whose responses will shape how this conflict eventually resolves. None of this should be read as a claim that Ukraine's position is without its own serious vulnerabilities. Ukraine continues to face its own manpower constraints, its own infrastructure damage from Russian strikes on its power grid, and its own dependence on the continuity of Western political support that Hodges identifies as one of the three critical conditions for further progress. The war remains, by any honest accounting, a contest between two sides each operating under enormous strain, each searching for the combination of technology, endurance, and political will that will allow them to outlast the other. What the analysis presented by Hodges, Giles, and Ingram suggests is not that this contest has already been decided, but that the momentum, at least for now, appears to have shifted in a direction that would have seemed difficult to predict at earlier stages of the war, and that the infrastructure campaign against Russian oil and gas facilities sits at the very center of that shift. As the summer months continue and the strikes persist, the questions that will determine the shape of the rest of this year are becoming clearer, even if their answers are not. Can Ukraine sustain the tempo of a campaign that has already stretched Russian rear area defenses to their limit? Will Western partners continue to supply the components, intelligence, and political backing that make long-range precision strikes possible at this scale? And can Russia, a state that has weathered sanctions, isolation, and years of grinding war, find a way to adapt its air defenses and its economy quickly enough to blunt a campaign that is now reaching directly into the daily lives of its own citizens? The answers to those three questions, more than any single battlefield engagement, are likely to determine whether this summer marks a genuine turning point in the war, or simply another difficult chapter in a conflict that has already defied so many earlier predictions about how and when it might end.